They say the dead don't return, that memory fades, that consciousness, once severed from flesh, dissolves into silence. But what if I told you that's a lie? That buried deep within the cracks of polite society, within the pews of sleepy churches and the brittle smiles of grieving parents, there's a horror no religion can explain. 57. Hexham, England. Two sisters, Joanna and Jacqueline Robertson, walked to church, hand in hand, innocence trailing behind them like a shadow. A car veers off the road, screams, shattered glass, blood on cobblestones, death. But it didn't end there. 18 months later, the same mother gives birth to twin girls, Gillian and Jennifer. Identical, yet marked. One bears a scar she never earned. The other cradles a toy she never touched. They speak of events they never lived, recount deaths they never died. This isn't a ghost story. This is a documented case, peer-reviewed, studied for decades by university psychiatrists who walked away shaken. What you're about to hear is not entertainment. It is initiation. Watch to the end, and you'll never look at death or identity the same way again. Welcome to the truth they tried to bury. What would you do if your child looked you in the eyes and described the exact moment they died, years before they were born? Florence Robertson didn't believe in reincarnation. She was a devout Catholic, rooted in doctrine, wrapped in tradition. But her husband, John, held a secret belief, one that would soon shatter the very fabric of their marriage. He had always whispered to God, not for comfort, not for healing, but for proof. Proof that the soul persists, that death is not the end, that something returns. And in October of 1958, something did. Florence gave birth to twin daughters, despite months of medical scans detecting only one. Doctors were stunned, but John, he was calm. Joanna and Jacqueline, he wist, paired. They've come home. The girls grew quickly. Perfect health, perfect smiles, but there was nothing perfect about what came next. Jennifer, one of the twins, was born with a birthmark identical to the scar Jacqueline received before her death. Same size, same spot, same story. Another mark appeared just above her hip, matching Jacqueline's long-forgotten birthmark. No genetic explanation, no medical precedent. Only silence from science. And terror in the eyes of their mother. Because Florence knew, those marks didn't belong to Jennifer. They belonged to the dead. At first, Florence clung to denial like a drowning woman clings to driftwood. She told herself it was coincidence, that birthmarks meant nothing, that her daughters were simply new. But the illusion cracked the moment the twins learned to speak. It began with toys. John had unpacked a box from the attic, forgotten relics of Joanna and Jacqueline's childhood. He set them aside without telling the twins their origin, and yet they knew. Gillian walked straight to a porcelain doll named Margaret. She picked it up, cradled it with reverence, and whispered, "I missed you." No hesitation, no confusion. She held it the same way Joanna once did. Then Jennifer found the stuffed rabbit, Jacqueline's rabbit. The ear was still torn. She pressed it to her cheek like a reflex. "Bunny," she said, the exact nickname only Jacqueline had ever used. Florence froze. No one had ever told them those names. No one. What followed was a cascade of the impossible, places they'd never been, names they couldn't know. One day, Gillian pointed to a school and said, "That's where I used to play." It was Joanna's old school. Jennifer panicked when she saw a car that resembled the one that killed her sister. They weren't remembering stories. They were reliving lives. By the time the twins turned 2.5, the line between the living and the dead had vanished completely. Florence heard them whispering in their room one spring morning. It was the tone, serious, reflective, not the babble of toddlers, but something older, haunted. She crept closer. "Do you remember the walk to church?" Gillian asked. "You were wearing your yellow dress." Jennifer replied without pause. "And Anthony was talking about his new bicycle." Florence's blood ran cold. Her knees weakened. The yellow dress, the bicycle, the boy, all real. All details from the morning her daughters were killed. Details that had never been spoken in front of the twins. Details Florence herself had buried deep in her grief. She rushed into the room. The twins looked up, startled, then silent, as if caught remembering something forbidden. This was no longer theory. This was evidence, and it broke something inside Florence. Because reincarnation wasn't just some comforting notion of souls floating peacefully between lives. This was trauma echoing through the veil, a cycle of suffering replayed in flesh. And the girls? They weren't dreaming about death. They were dragging it into the present. One memory at a time. You have to understand, this wasn't just about spooky memories or childhood oddities. This was psychological precision. These twins weren't playing. They were remembering. When researchers from the University of Virginia heard about the case, they didn't laugh. They came. Leading them was Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist who had spent his career documenting cases of children with verifiable past life memories. But even he admitted, the Pollock Twins case was different. It wasn't just compelling, it was disturbing. The girls not only remembered events, they felt them. Jennifer had an aversion to cars, violent primal fear. Whenever a vehicle approached, she'd scream, clutch her head and shout, "The car, it's coming!" No one taught her that. No one told her how Jacqueline died. Gillian, meanwhile, would often speak like a caretaker, protective, maternal, just like Joanna was to her younger sister. The role was embedded in her identity, passed down like some invisible genetic memory. Dr. Stevenson began documenting everything. Dates, drawings, interviews. He found 33 separate points of evidence suggesting the twins were continuations, not copies, of Joanna and Jacqueline. He presented it in journals, peer-reviewed and coldly clinical. But make no mistake, he was terrified. Florence tried to shield them from the whispers, from the fear, from the burden of carrying someone else's death inside them, but the past had already latched on. During one afternoon walk through Hexham's narrow streets, the twins stopped in front of a row of houses. Jennifer pointed to one. "That's where we used to live," she said, "with the garden out back and the gate that squeaked." Gillian nodded. "And that scary man next door with the dog that barked at us." They had never lived there, but Joanna and Jacqueline had. Later that week, Florence overheard them discussing the accident. Not with sorrow, but with resignation, like veterans describing a war no one believes they fought. "It was fast," Jennifer said. "I didn't see her face, just the sky." Gillian nodded solemnly. "Then the pain, and then it got quiet." Florence couldn't breathe. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't the wild invention of children. This was lived experience, leaking through the cracks of time. And here's the part they don't want you to hear. The soul doesn't die. It lingers. It waits. And sometimes, it returns to finish what was left undone. Comment below. I remember the sky. Post it twice. Lock in your transformation. Something ancient was at work here, not paranormal, not mystical, systemic. You see, reincarnation isn't just a spiritual belief, it's a control mechanism, a feedback loop, a recycling of trauma. Souls returned not to heal, but to suffer again, to keep reliving the impact, the betrayal, the unfinished. That's what was happening in Hexham. The girls began reenacting patterns. Gillian developed strong maternal instincts toward Jennifer, just as Joanna had once protected Jacqueline. Jennifer, in turn, would regress into behaviors far too young for her age, clinging to Gillian during thunderstorms, hiding behind her in crowds. It was like watching a replay in flesh and blood. But it went deeper. The twins began to develop phobias they couldn't explain, obsessions with certain colors, symbols, and dates. Jennifer would cry on May 5th every year with no understanding why. Gillian refused to wear blue dresses, the same dress Joanna died in. Dr. Stevenson documented it all. But here's the piece he never published. When he interviewed the girls alone, they spoke of waiting, of darkness, of hearing their parents pray for them across a void, of being pulled back, not by love, but by force, because something summoned them. Florence began dreaming again. Not dreams of comfort, but of duplication, of walking into her daughter's room and seeing two Joannas, two Jacquelines, standing at the edge of the bed speaking in unison, smiling in a way children never should. She stopped sleeping. The girls, she said, were beginning to know things no child should, family secrets, words no one had spoken aloud in years. Gillian once described the inside of a church crypt no one had visited since the funeral. Jennifer spoke in her sleep, whispering fragments of Latin prayers neither parent had ever taught them. And then there were the drawings. They started as innocent screeds, tableaux, but soon became detailed sketches of churches, car crashes, broken glass, even the face of a woman Florence instantly recognized. Marjorie Wynne, the woman who killed her daughters. The twins had never seen a photo of her, never heard her name. And yet Jennifer drew her face perfectly. Same eyes, same grim mouth, same vacant stare Florence saw in court. It was no longer just memory. It was tracking. These girls weren't simply reincarnated. They were reliving, reconstructing, reclaiming, and something was guiding them, line by line. By the time the twins turned 4, the phenomenon could no longer be hidden. Teachers noticed, neighbors whispered, the Robertson name became a quiet legend in Hexham, spoken in low tones at market stalls and church steps, not because of grief, but because of fear. The girls began speaking in code, private phrases that had no known origin. "The glass remembers," they would say before bedtime, or, "We left part of ourselves in the stones." Florence wrote them down in a notebook, terrified that if she didn't, the phrases would follow her into her dreams. John, on the other hand, saw these moments as validation. He believed God had returned his daughters through divine will, that this was a holy miracle. But Florence had begun to see it differently, not divine, deliberate, a haunting with purpose. One evening, Florence found the twins in the attic, digging through boxes they'd never been shown. They'd found an old photograph of Joanna and Jacqueline. Gillian pointed at Joanna and said, "That's me, before I changed." Jennifer pointed to Jacqueline and simply said, "That's my old skin. Old skin. Let that settle." These were not just girls. They were containers. And something old was waking up inside them. At exactly 3:12 a.m. on November the 14th, 1960, Jennifer screamed in her sleep. When Florence burst into the room, both girls were sitting up in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the corner of the ceiling. Not crying, not speaking, just watching. The next morning, Gillian said, "She was here again." "Who?" Florence asked. "The lady with no eyes." Florence collapsed in the hallway. That was the name Jacqueline used to whisper before her death. The lady with no eyes, a shadow figure she claimed would appear just before the accident. A hallucination, the doctors said. But now another child saw her, another incarnation. Florence began keeping journals, not of memories, but of patterns, every fear, every phrase, every moment of déjà vu. She noticed something chilling. The girls' behaviors were synchronized with dates tied to Joanna and Jacqueline, their nightmares aligned with anniversaries, their phobias triggered by seemingly random events, until she matched them to her old calendar. It was as if time had bent, as if some unseen hand had pressed replay on a trauma that wasn't finished. Not karma, not healing. A loop, an experiment, repeating designed, tested, observed. Because what happened in Hexham wasn't spiritual. It was procedural. Dr. Ian Stevenson returned to Hexham in late 1961. Not as a skeptic this time, but as a man disturbed. He had documented over 200 cases of past life recall in children. But none like this. None where two lives, interrupted by violent death, reappeared so precisely, so surgically, within the same bloodline. He interviewed the girls again, alone, methodically. What he heard chilled him to his core. Gillian described standing behind a mirror after death, watching her parents mourn, watching the funeral, feeling pulled back, not by love, but by a voice that said, "Not finished." Jennifer described waiting in the Blaine room, where other children sat in silence, some screaming, some rocking, all of them remembering. When Stevenson asked what brought her out, she said, "The light turned red, and it was time. Not white. Red." That detail never made it into his official reports, but in a private letter to a colleague, one that was buried until 1999, Stevenson confessed, "If what I saw in those girls is real, then reincarnation is not mystical. It is managed, and whoever manages it has no interest in mercy." This wasn't rebirth, it was containment. In 1963, the twins, now aged 6, stopped speaking of their past lives. At least, publicly. To the outside world, the memories faded, as Stevenson predicted. Teachers reported them as well-adjusted. No more visions, no more strange drawings, no more cryptic language. But Florence knew better. The silence wasn't healing, it was hiding. One night, she overheard Gillian whispering to Jennifer, "Don't say it anymore, they're listening." When asked who they were, the girls went quiet. Their eyes said everything. Not fear of monsters, fear of observers. That same winter, a neighbor named Edna Holloway, who once testified in Marjorie Wynne's defense, was found dead in her greenhouse. A heart attack, the coroner said. But her eyes were wide open, her fingernails torn, and scrawled in the dirt beside her body were 2 words. She remembers. No fingerprints, no suspects, just the echo of something Florence refused to say aloud. The girls were no longer reliving the past. They were correcting it. And the cycle wasn't ending. It was deepening. Florence burned the journals. She stopped answering Stevenson's letters. And when the twins turned 8, the family quietly moved to Canada. But shadows, you see, don't stay buried. They wait. Canada offered no escape. The town was quiet, remote, a place where nobody knew their names or the weight they carried, but within weeks the signs returned, more subtle now, like something learning how to camouflage itself. Gillian began waking with nosebleeds, always at 3:12 a.m. Jennifer started locking her bedroom window each night. When asked why, she simply said, "He watches from the trees." Florence begged John to take her seriously. He told her they were just nightmares, growing pains. But even he began to notice things, whispers in the hallway when no one was home, the television flickering to static at exactly the same time every day. And then came the letters. No return address, just envelopes with children's drawings, sketches of the twins sleeping, of Florence screaming, of Marjorie Wynne's car mid-collision, details no one outside the family could possibly know. One envelope held a single newspaper clipping. Driver who killed twins, paroled after 9 years. Marjorie Wynne was free. The same day they opened that envelope, Gillian stood at the foot of her parents' bed and calmly said, "She's not supposed to be out. We still have work to do." Not vengeance, obligation. A cycle unfinished. They found Marjorie Wynne's body in a motel room outside Brighton in 1965. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, just her, lying perfectly still on the bed, eyes open, hands folded, as if she had accepted something, or expected it. But the detail that never made the papers? Her palms were burned, both of them, as if she'd grasped something hot, something beyond comprehension. On the wall, in lipstick, one phrase was scrawled backward. "The glass remembers." The same phrase Gillian and Jennifer had whispered years earlier. Florence wept when she saw it on the news, not from grief, from confirmation. The pattern was closing, the loop was tightening. That night, Jennifer walked into the kitchen, placed a Polaroid of Marjorie's crime scene on the table, where she'd gotten it, no one knows, and calmly said, "We can sleep now." The girls' nightmares stopped. The whispers ended. The drawings ceased. But Florence never recovered. Because now she knew. This wasn't a miracle. It wasn't even reincarnation. It was a rebalancing mechanism. Something, or someone, pulling strings across lifetimes to correct what man cannot. An intelligence behind tragedy. Not spiritual, systemic. And it had used her daughters to deliver judgment. Years passed. The twins grew, married, had children of their own. But Florence never stopped watching them, searching their eyes for traces of Joanna and Jacqueline, or something even older, something worse. She saw flickers sometimes, in the way Jennifer would pause outside mirrors, or how Gillian never let her daughter play near roads. There was always that pull, like gravity, dragging them back toward the wound that made them. Then, in 1987, just before Florence's death, she recorded a final tape. Never meant for the public. It was found hidden behind a false panel in her bedroom wall. On the tape, her voice trembles. "They weren't mine. Not really. Just borrowed. I think we all are. Pieces of something playing itself out. Not reincarnation, not punishment, a system. Testing emotional feedback through flesh. Trauma makes the pattern clearer. It's the glue." She pauses, then whispers, "They weren't the first. They won't be the last. And it's still learning." The tape ends with a sound, a child's laugh, echoing, mechanical, then silence. The Pollock twins never publicly discussed their memories again. But in a 2001 interview, Gillian was asked if she believed in reincarnation. She smiled and said, "Not in the way you think. They were born again. Not in Hexham, not even in England." But in 2014, a schoolteacher in Vancouver documented something strange. Twin girls, age 5, refused to respond to their given names. They answered only to Joe and Jackie. Neither parent knew the significance. The girls had never been to Europe, never studied history, yet they could describe, in eerie detail, the old market square in Hexham, the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Church, even the exact brand of red coat Jacqueline wore on the day she died. The teacher reported the behavior to a psychologist. The case was quietly dismissed. But a year later, both girls vanished during a school field trip. Their bodies were never found. In 2016, a janitor cleaning a storage unit behind the school discovered a single item taped beneath a desk, an aged photograph of Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock. On the back, scribbled in a child's handwriting, "This time, we remember everything." This story never made headlines. It wasn't meant to, because the truth isn't just strange. It's structured, hidden beneath normal lives, correcting what law and justice cannot. This isn't about ghosts. It's about architecture, patterns, loops, and the horrifying possibility that we are not born free. We are born programmed.